Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Wang Mengmang in Beijing. China joined the WTO in 2001, which was one of the major events since the establishment of the organization. However, the WTO is now facing challenges concerning its effectiveness and influence in global trade. So what role will the organization continue to play in the context of free trade agreements? And how should we evaluate the relationship between China and the WTO? And what can we really expect from President Trump based on candidate Trump's apparent anti-globalization and isolationist sentiments? To discuss all these issues and more, I'm delighted to have this exclusive interview with Pascal Lamy, former Director General of the World Trade Organization. But before we get to our discussion, let's take a look at this.
Pascal Lamy is a French political consultant and businessman. From 1999 to 2004, Mr. Lamy was European Commissioner for Trade, and between 2005 and 2013 served as Director General of the World Trade Organization. As a trade expert, he has a profound understanding of the development of global trade. He remains a strong proponent of globalization, but has noted that because opening trade and reshuffling production systems foster intense competitive pressures, the process is painful but results in efficiency. He also believes obstacles to trade, such as distance, protection of national producers, and unequal protection of consumers, should be reduced. Pascal Lamy is currently the honorary president of the Paris-based think tank Notre Europe.
Mr. Lamy, thank you so much for joining us on Dialogue. While most of the attention right now on globalization is focused on U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's recent plans to pull out of the TPP, I'd like to begin our discussion from Europe, where you are from. Back in June this year, the British referendum on leaving the European Union reflected a popular backlash against globalization. There are fears of the negative impacts of immigration as well as free trade agreements. What are your views on this growing trend of anti-globalization?
I'm less sanguine than conventional wisdom on that. Because Brexit is not about anti-globalization. The British people believe they can do better alone in globalization rather than with the European Union. That's the view they've expressed. True, in the US there is a rather populistic anti-trade rhetoric, and that was a large part of Mr. Trump's campaign. But the US is the US and Europe is Europe. The US has a much weaker social safety net than in Europe. Hence, globalization, trade, the sort of competitive shock that trade opening creates in social and economic systems is much tougher in the US than it is in Europe. In Europe, we have a part of public opinion, which is the one that is hurt by trade expansion, by globalization, by the refitting of production systems that more open trade brings, but it is much better cushioned than in the US. Now, if it's about something totally new, that trade opening works because it's painful, and it's painful because it works, nothing much new on that. We've known that for centuries, since the theory of international trade was written by Mr. Ricardo or Mr. Schumpeter. Globalization is one version of capitalism. Capitalism is both efficient and painful. And it is efficient because it's painful, and it's painful because it is efficient. And in places where social systems are weak, there is more popular reaction against economic change, materialized, symbolized by expansion of trade, whereas we know that the major cause of these changes is with technology. But trade opening accelerates the impact of technological change, because if I do something better than you do, and if you do something better than I do, we have a rational interest of exchanging. I will benefit from your know-how, and you will benefit from my know-how. My know-how will be accelerated by technological change. Your know-how will be accelerated by technological change.
So exchange and connectivity is very important in facilitating trade, of course. And you are the honorary president of Neutral Europe, forgive my French. That's a think tank which aims to think a united Europe. So from your perspective, do you think that the Brexit signal a potential breakup of the European Union?
Frankly, not. And by the way, if you look at polls in EU 27, i.e. the continental part of Europe, in no country on the continent of Europe, the remaining 27, is there a potential majority to exit the European Union. So the British case has always been very specific. We know full well that the Brits joined the European Union in the 70s for economic reasons and not for political reasons. And the reason why there was a slight majority in favor of Brexit is purely political. Nobody really believes that the UK will do better outside of the European Union. The growth, the economic, the welfare of the British people will probably be lower than it was in the European Union. But they prefer to be sovereign, independent, to be, quote unquote, in control, insofar as a 60 million country can be in control of something in a globalized world. That's their view. So in many ways, political passion trumped economic rationality. Is this the beginning of the end for the European Union? No. If you look at polls, the support for European Union went up on the continent after the UK Brexit, rather than going down. Now, that doesn't mean that European integration is something easy. It's difficult, it's complex. It is in a period where we have many crises. We had a problem with Greece at the time, we have the problem with migrants, we had these problems with Russia in Ukraine and Crimea. So we have a series of problems, but I don't think that the solution to these problems is less Europe, it's probably more Europe.
Let's now expand our discussion to a broader perspective. For example, we mentioned that the WTO is now facing some challenges nowadays, is trying to adapt to this new reality in the context of free trade agreements that's been heralded by different countries, whether it's from a bilateral perspective, multilateral, or even regional. So what are your thoughts on these initiatives? Are they weakening the influence and effectiveness of the WTO?
No, on this question of whether a trade opening works multilateral or bilateral or regional, I'm with a Chinese proverb. Don't mind the color of the cat, provided it catches mice. So the mice are obstacle to trade. Whether obstacle to trade disappear through multilateral, regional, bilateral, whatever, what matters is that obstacles to trade are reduced. So the way you do that doesn't really matter. And by the way, in the past, there's never been a serious contradiction between opening trade multilaterally, bilaterally, regionally, unilaterally, because it sometimes also happens, and this notion that bilateral deals are easier than multilateral deals, which was very fashionable 2 or 3 years ago, that's not what TTIP or TPP or even RCEP are showing. The best solution remains multilateral, but there are other options available.
I also want to mention this case from Europe. The EU recently drew global attention from its reluctance to fulfill its obligations under Article 15 of the Protocol on China's accession to the WTO in 2001. And according to that article, China would automatically gain the market economy status after the surrogate country approach expires on December 11th, meaning that WTO members will no longer be allowed to use the surrogate country system in their anti-dumping investigations against China. So it seems that the European Union is trying to extend this surrogate country system against China. Do you think this is fair, or is China's status into the WTO, its accession into the WTO will be renegotiated?
I don't think EU is going in the direction you are mentioning. My expectation, and I'm not speaking for the European Union, I'm totally free or independent, my expectation is that they will recognize that this special status, which was for communist countries in the past and which allow some flexibility in the numbering of anti-dumping margins, and this is only to do with trade defense, anti-dumping, anti-subsidies. My expectation is that EU will, to the difference of the US, recognize that China is not anymore a communist country and will apply this 15-year deadline. But in the meantime, EU will also adjust, modernize its anti-dumping regulations, but not only vis-à-vis China, but vis-à-vis everybody. So we will have, that's my expectation, a recognition that China is not anymore on this list, which is the EU interpretation of the protocol, while there will be a slight change in the way anti-dumping margins are calculated. I think the US will take another option, which is interpreting the same convention, which was signed when China joined WTO in 2001, in a different way, i.e. not recognizing now China as a market economy status for the purpose of anti-dumping calculations.
But just last month, the European Union presented a new proposal using this term market distortion as a substitute for non-market economy, and that, of course, has become a source of concern for China.
I think EU, as I said, will adjust its anti-dumping systems while remaining compliant with WTO, and they will do that in a non-discriminatory way, i.e. not targeting specifically China. The new EU anti-dumping regime will be the same for China, US, Brazil, India, South Africa, or Egypt. So no any more discrimination as it was provided with this 15-year extension of the sort of communist country status.
We'll wait and see what happens when the surrogate country system expires. We're going to continue our discussion in just a moment, Mr. Lamy. You're watching Dialogue. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Dialogue. We're going to continue our discussion with Mr. Pascal Lamy. So, Mr. Lamy, a lot of people have been making this comparison between the Brexit and the recent election victory by President-elect Donald Trump, saying that there are certain similarities between their supporters. For example, they're both white, blue-collar workers who have a lower level of education and who have been effectively left behind by globalization. Do you find this comparison making any sense at all?
Yes, to some extent, yes. Although US is very different from EU, and to some extent UK is very different from EU. But there is something common, which is that the speed of economic change, partially accelerated by globalization and trade expansion, has severely impacted social and economic fabrics, and that in places where social systems are weak, some people have been left over, and there is a legitimate reaction against that. Now, whether the angst, the anxiety, the fear, the recrimination, the antagonism is or not captured by populist movement is another question. The reality in UK and in US is that populist forces has been better than normal, more rational political forces to exploit these feelings and transform them into electoral victory. So UKIP in UK or Trumpism in the US have surfed on this wave of miscontent. Now, that's a fact, And there is something common there, although a part of this also stems from anti-immigration and xenophobic resentment, which has nothing to do with trade.
Is it possible at all to separate this emotional perspective from this pure economic or political perspective?
You're absolutely correct. There is a bit of both. Now, my sense, for what it's worth, and I've looked at very serious studies on that, is that the explanation is roughly 1/3 because of economic, 2/3 because of cultural backlash. So the impact of immigration, the impact of social change, the impact of the changes this brings in families, women's rights, the evolution of social standards is extremely important, and that these movements have a simple way of saying, we will fix this. We will fix this in protectionism. Let's isolate ourselves from this terrible world. And they will fix this in going back to tradition. Old times. This notion that old times were good times and that they should be back. I think this is wrong. Protectionism will not work. Protectionism does not protect. What protects people is social security. What needs to be done to address these legitimate concerns, and I'm saying they are legitimate concerns, there are people left over. There are people who left their jobs because of globalization. They usually are the weakest, and the solution is in decreasing social insecurity. It's not in protection. And as far as culture is concerned, I think we have to live in a world where identity is very important, but is open. We cannot, in today's world, close our borders, build walls everywhere, and go back to the Middle Ages. This will not work. It simply is regressive. And I think we probably will see in the future that this sort of simplistic way of saying we will fix our problems in going back to the past do not work. We have to look to the future.
And talking about culture, I want to go off topic a little bit. France officially declared its candidacy to the World Expo on November 22nd. And according to President François Hollande, the theme that France has chosen for the 2025 Expo is knowledge to be shared and the planet to be protected, which is very different from so many previous ones, which focuses on the protection of natural resources as well as technological advancement. So why did France choose this theme?
Well, the President of the Republic, among the various options I suggested to him, because I'm the guy running this candidacy for the government, choose this theme, which is both better sharing of knowledge and better caring about the planet. Knowledge to share, planet to care. And the reason why he did this, because when we talk to young people, and we have to talk to young people to try and think of what's going to be relevant in 2025, which is roughly 10 years from now, what these young people told us is, we want more education, we want more science, we want more technology. We love technology, but we are afraid that our planet is not in good health. So the result of these consultations, of hearing these people, was this choice by the President of the Republic for the French theme, for this candidacy for 2025, which is Paris, of course. Knowledge to share, planet to care. Convergence of these two things. It's going back to the tradition of world exhibitions in the 19th century, where it was about knowledge, progress, technology, new techniques, production systems. Remember the Eiffel Tower in 1889, the Grand Palais in 1900, and something which we've learned since, which is that our planet is in danger in some respects, environmentally wise, and we have to care more about this. So putting technology, science to the service of making our planet more environmentally sustainable is something which is enthusiastic for young people, and that's why we've chosen this theme.
So France has successfully held many international events. What are your thoughts on the chances to win this time?
It's a competition. and fine with that. I mean, the best candidacy will win. The vote will take place in 2018. France is also competing for the Olympic Games in 2024. So we are pitching for both the Olympic Games in 2024 and the Universal Expo 2025. And in order to make sure that the Paris region is ready, we are investing roughly 40 billion euros in new tube systems and in a specific rail link, direct express rail link between Roissy, Charles de Gaulle, which is the big Paris airport hub, and the Paris town itself. So there's quite a lot of things going on so that we are properly prepared and we can welcome many, many Chinese tourists in 2025.
Well, a lot to look forward to, Mr. Lamy, but I'm going to have to invite you back to more heavy topics. So you mentioned that growth in global trade volume has slowed since the financial crisis to 3% from 5%. But you've said that free trade has more support than many people would think, and that things would reaccelerate at some stage. What leads you to that conclusion?
What leads me to that conclusion is a thorough technical observation of what these numbers mean. These numbers mean that the volume of trade is increasing less than in the past. Now, one of the reasons why the volumes of trade increased a lot in the past was the rapid expansion of these global value chains, which means that instead of something being produced in one country and exported in another country, the thing is produced in many, many countries. The things I wear today are probably produced in 8 different countries, depending on the fabric, depending on where it's cut, depending on the button, depending. So that's the world of today. Made in the world, not made in China, not made in US, not made in Germany, made in the world because bits and pieces, and that's also true for services. So this expansion of global supply chain has resulted in volumes of trade rocketing. At some stage, this plateaus. At some stage, China, which is what's happening, is adding more value to what it produces. 20 years ago, China would import 60 and export 100, adding 40 Chinese value to the 60 it would import. Today, China imports 30 and adds 70 instead of 60. Now, that's good news for China. It means that China is moving up the value addition layer. It's good news for the rest of the world because the Chinese economy is expanding. It's bad news for the volumes of trade. But so what? Trade expansion is not an end in itself. Trade expansion is good when it helps you growing your economy. So we should not overinterpret this. The volumes of world trade need to be interpreted carefully. And again, let's remember what matters is whether you create jobs for your country, you create good jobs. If the volumes of trade contribute to that, fine. If the volumes of trade decrease while you are doing this, fine also.
Well, President Xi Jinping expressed a strong stance towards anti-globalization, rather, at the APEC leaders meeting in Peru, saying that Chinese companies will not close its door to the outside world, but rather it will keep the door even wider. And China also stepped up to propose 2 free trade deals in the Asia-Pacific region. So do you think that China is taking the responsibility for things that have been enthusiastically advocated by the U.S.?
I think China is talking the talk. Remains to be seen whether China will walk the talk. So it's good to have this sort of signal. It's an important sense of direction that has been given at the APEC meeting by President Xi. Whether this results in more Chinese trade opening, which implies more reforms in the Chinese economy, this remains a question mark. We've had for quite a bit of time signals that China is in favor of more trade opening, of more trade expansion, hence of more reforms. We haven't had that a lot of reforms, so the direction, the signal, the body language is okay. Let's see whether this now translates into effective movements on reforms. I hope this will come in the years to come.
And many are arguing that the Doha round of talks is now almost dead. What are your response to that? Do you think it still have any effectiveness today? And what is the WTO doing to try to revive that initiative?
I mean, I think, contrary to conventional wisdom, WTO is not in bad shape. I mean, there was a very major trade agreement on trade facilitation, which I recognize is not headline catching, because modernizing customs procedure is not something that's really big news for you. But I can tell you, if I'm an average exporter, having customs red tape reduced is extremely good news for me. So this is happening. There is an agreement in the cooking on environmental goods and services in order to foster the trade in environmentally friendly goods and services. This is coming. There is a big negotiation on services, which is not, I mean, ultra rapid, but which is coming. So I'm not of this view that WTO is inactive. True, part of the agenda of the Doha round has not been moving. Other parts of the agenda, such as this trade facilitation agreement, have been moving. What matters at the end of the day is that A, trade keeps open, and B, that trade keeps opening. If I look at trade today, it's more open than yesterday, and yesterday it was more open than the day before yesterday. So the direction is still the right one. We have to be careful, again, that protectionist discourse does not translate into action, and that's something that needs to be watched. But for the moment, I'm not among those who are crying wolf. I prefer to cry wolf when the wolf is next door. That's not the case for the moment.
You appealed for the WTO to adapt to changes of today's trade. So what exactly are you expecting for the WTO in terms of reform in the near future, and what kind of role would it continue to play to facilitate trade around the world?
I think, facilitating trade is a no-brainer. You have to reduce obstacles to trade. Obstacles to trade are distance. Technology is caring for that. Infrastructures such as One Belt, One Road, for instance, are good initiatives that will facilitate trade. Then you have to reduce obstacle to trade, the purpose of which is to protect domestic producers, tariffs, subsidies. That's happening little by little. And then you have now, and that's more important for the future, to cope with obstacle to trade stemming from differences in measures to protect the consumer. Standards, packaging, pesticide residues in flowers, safety of car equipment. This is the major thing for the future. And this is not, for the moment, that much with the WTO. Harmonizing precaution standard is more to do with specific international organizations. I think WTO should overview this process, but you cannot negotiate pesticide residue standards. It's something that has to be done by technicians. Same for crash tests for cars, same for prudential regulations in insurance and banking. So that has to happen in a different way than in the past, although it should be overviewed by the WTO.
So the bulk of WTO's task is to monitor the performance of member countries and to even adjudicate trade disputes.
You're absolutely right. And of course, the role of WTO in adjudicating trade disputes is extremely important, because it's the only real constraining international dispute settlement. And China knows that because China won a number of cases in the WTO dispute settlement. China did lose a number of cases, but it's also won a number of cases, which shows that it is done seriously, legally, and objectively.
Mr. Pascal Lamy, thank you so much for
pleasure.
your insights on this.